Welcome to another custom-tailored deep dive. We are just thrilled to have you with us again.
Absolute thrilled.
Because the ever-curious learner, you're tuning in because you want to get past the surface noise, right?
Right.
You want to truly understand the machinery of how we know what we know.
Or perhaps in today's case, how we only think we know what we know.
Exactly. And today, we have a strictly bounded, highly focused mission.
Very focused.
We are looking exclusively at part one of Charles Fort's provocative, honestly mind-bending book,
New Lands.
New Lands. And the mission of this deep dive is to shatter the illusion of settled science.
Which is a tall order.
It is, but we are going to examine Fort's relentless, incredibly detailed, and brilliant crusade against the astronomical dogmas of his time.
It really is a masterclass.
Okay, let's unpack this. Whether you're prepping for a debate on critical thinking, catching up on the history of science, or you're just, insanely curious about how human beings construct reality.
Fort's work is essential. It's a masterclass in questioning authority.
And to set the analytical stage for you, the listener, I want you to picture something.
Okay, paint the picture.
Imagine an antique observatory.
Right, the visual backdrop for today's conversation.
Exactly. You are surrounded by heavy brass telescopes, intricate hand-drawn star charts, and the distinct scent of old paper and leather bindings.
That is exactly the world Charles Fort was scrutinizing.
It is.
But Fort isn't just throwing stones at the sky for the sake of being a contrarian.
No, he's definitely not.
He is exposing the deep psychological traps of confirmation bias.
Yeah.
He's warning us against the danger of treating science as an unquestionable priestcraft.
A priestcraft, that's the word he uses.
Methodically showing us how data is manipulated, ignored, or just bent to fit pre-existing theories.
Because we have this hook, right? Imagine finding out that the most celebrated astronomical discoveries in human history,
The ones taught as gospel in school.
right, things you accepted as absolute fact, might actually be based on faked math,
Fixed math.
optical lens defects,
Yeah.
and intense professional peer pressure.
It changes everything.
Fort dives right into the deep end in part one. He describes the scientific establishment of his time as a puritanical orthodoxy.
He does. And that word priestcraft comes up again.
He states their ultimate commandment to the rest of the world is,
Thou shalt not.
"Thou shalt not."
That phrase is the linchpin to understanding Fort's entire critique of the scientific method as it was practiced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
So,
Well, he's arguing that this astronomical priestcraft has crystallized its dogmas into frozen textbooks.
right.
They literally dictate what can and cannot be observed.
So if a phenomenon doesn't fit the established mathematical model,
It's ignored
that's a problem.
or explained away with increasingly absurd rationalizations.
Fort's overarching argument here is profound. He claims there has never actually been an astronomical discovery made by pure mathematical calculation,
Never.
which is a massive claim.
He asserts they are all observational or purely accidental.
And the math is just draped over the discovery after the fact.
Exactly. To make the astronomers look like infallible prophets.
Okay, let's hold on that for a second, because we are taught that the discovery of the planet Neptune was the ultimate triumph of mathematical deduction.
The pinnacle of science.
If you read Sir Robert Ball's The Story of the Heavens, which Fort quotes extensively, the discovery of Neptune is framed as unparalleled.
It's a very dramatic narrative.
You have the great French astronomer Leverrier.
Buried for months in profound meditation.
Right. And then the dramatic moment arrives. Leverrier rises from his calculations, points his finger to a specific spot in the sky, and says, "Lo."
Low, and a new planet is found exactly where he pointed.
It sounds like magic. It sounds like the absolute validation of the scientific method.
But Fort looked at the primary sources and found a very different story.
A significantly messier story.
Vastly messier. Fort digs into the actual historical records of the time, and the illusion of a clean mathematical triumph just vanishes.
Okay, lay it out for us.
First of all, there was no consensus whatsoever among the supposed high priest's astronomy.
None at all.
According to Leverrier, there was one planet external to Uranus causing gravitational perturbations.
Okay.
But according to another prominent astronomer of the era, Hansen, there were two planets.
So they didn't even agree on the number of planets.
And according to Sir George Airy, the Astronomer Royal of England, it was highly doubtful if there were even one. It was a theoretical free-for-all.
So they didn't agree on what they were looking for, but what about Leverrier's actual math? Because that's where Fort meticulously dismantles the myth.
Leverrier calculated that this hypothetical planet was at a distance from the sun within the limits of 35 and 37.9 times this Earth's distance from the sun.
And where was Neptune actually found?
In a position that was 30 times the Earth's distance from the sun.
Okay, wait. Let's put that in perspective for you, the listener. The difference between 35 times the Earth's distance and 30 times the Earth's distance
Is roughly 500 to 600 million miles.
600 million miles. That is a colossal discrepancy.
It is.
If an engineer missed a structural calculation by a proportional margin, the bridge would collapse.
Instantly. The gap was so huge that, at the time, American astronomers absolutely refused to accept that Neptune had been discovered by means of Leverrier's calculations.
Because the math just didn't work.
Fort points to publications like the American Journal of Science from that period to prove this wasn't some fringe conspiracy.
Mainstream American scientists were actively arguing that the math simply didn't match the reality of the observation.
It was a highly contested issue that history has completely smoothed over.
And Fort brings in Dr. Babinet, right?
Yes, a highly respected figure who read a paper to the French Academy in 1849.
And what did he find?
Babinet showed that, based on 3 years of actual observation of Neptune, its revolution would have to be placed at 165 years.
But Leverrier had mathematically calculated something completely different.
Between 207 and 233 years.
The math was fundamentally wrong.
Fundamentally. Furthermore, the narrative of the precise pinpoint prediction is equally flawed.
Right, because while Leverrier was supposedly pinpointing the planet in France, an English astronomer named Adams was also supposedly calculating its position.
But the area Adams pointed to was so vast that Professor Challis, who was tasked with physically searching that region of the sky, wrote that it would take him months to chart all the stars in that area.
Months. That is not pointing to a precise mathematical coordinate.
No.
That is vaguely gesturing at a massive swath of the sky.
Exactly.
I want to make sure I'm following the logic here. It's essentially like someone throwing a dart at the side of a barn.
Yeah.
Then someone else walks up, finds a target painted on a completely different wall, and the first guy says, "See? I told you there was a target over there."
That's a perfect analogy.
So why do we only hear the triumphant version of this story? Why is the messiness scrubbed from the textbooks?
Because humans, and particularly institutional structures, crave a narrative of the triumphant genius.
We want the hero.
What is so deeply fascinating here is the psychological phenomenon of how a scientific community filters its own history to maintain its authority.
Right.
When one astronomer out of hundreds working globally points somewhere roughly within 600 million miles of an object that is eventually found by an observer,
The establishment crowns him the Leverrier of the textbooks.
he becomes an immortal hero of deduction.
Meanwhile, the hundreds of other astronomers who calculate, predict, publish, and find absolutely nothing
Are conveniently forgotten.
erased.
Their failures are erased to preserve the illusion that the mathematical models are flawless predictors of reality.
And that habit of rewriting history to favor the establishment's preferred narrative doesn't just apply to Neptune.
No, it happens again and again.
Fort finds the exact same psychological trap with the discovery of the asteroid belt.
Oh, this is a great example.
The Orthodox textbook narrative tells us that astronomers use something called Bode's law
Right, Bode's law.
to mathematically deduce that there should be a missing planet between Jupiter and Mars.
So they formed a task force,
Baron von Zach formed an elite society of 24 brilliant astronomers,
dubbed the Celestial Police.
which is an amazing name.
They organized systematically, dividing the zodiac into 24 zones, assigning one to each astronomer to rigorously search based on this mathematical law.
And after all that organized, mathematically driven searching, what did the Celestial Police find?
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing, not a single asteroid.
Instead, the first asteroid, Ceres, was found by a man named Piazzi.
And it was entirely by accident.
Entirely, he wasn't part of von Zach's elite group. He wasn't looking for a hypothetical planet based on Bode's law.
He was just working.
On the night of January 1st, 1801, he was simply doing routine, independent observational work, charting standard stars in the constellation Taurus.
And he noticed a light that he thought had moved.
As Fort describes it, Piazzi's mind was completely blank regarding brilliant mathematical deductions.
He had no theoretical agenda.
In fact, he initially announced to the world that he had discovered a comet.
He didn't even conceptualize what an asteroid was.
Yet, as Fort masterfully points out, Later writers craftily rewrite this messy, accidental history
They massage the narrative.
to make it seem like Piazzi's discovery was the direct, triumphant culmination of von Zach's organized, deductive search.
It's the manufacturing of the illusion of control.
Exactly. The scientific establishment desperately wants to present a front to the public that the universe is perfectly predictable through their specific symbols of the infinitesimal calculus.
He wants you to believe that if you just have the right equation, you master the cosmos.
But Fort exposes the sheer absurdity of this by bringing up something called the problem of the three bodies.
Okay, let's unpack that for a moment because it sounds highly technical, but the implication is staggering.
Yeah.
What exactly is the problem of the three bodies in this context?
In celestial mechanics, it's a well-known foundational issue. It states that astronomers and mathematicians cannot perfectly formulate or calculate the mutual gravitational interactions of just three celestial bodies moving in space.
Just three.
Just three. The math becomes chaotic and impossibly complex almost immediately.
So what do?
They have to use approximations and perturbation theory to even get close.
Yet, despite admitting they cannot perfectly calculate the interaction of three bodies, these same astronomers confidently claim to calculate the exact absolute orbits of planets that are simultaneously interacting with 1,000 other bodies in the solar system.
It's absurd.
That feels like a massive cognitive dissonance. How do they justify that leap?
How do they look the public in the eye and say, we can't solve for three, but trust our math for 1,000?
Yeah, exactly.
They explain it away by claiming that the sun's gravitational power is so overwhelmingly dominant that all the other complex gravitational effects from other planets and moons are simply negligible.
Negligible. They just sweep the chaotic reality under the rug of mathematical convenience.
Fort says one of his most lasting impressions of astronomers is that they explain and explain and explain.
And when their explanations inevitably fail to align with observation,
And they don't question their foundational premises.
they just invent new variables and calculate some more.
Which brings us to a perfect illustration of this hubris, the story of Professor Planey Chase.
Oh, Planey Chase is such a tragicomic figure in this book.
He really is.
He is the ultimate example of the forgotten astronomer who calculated and found nothing, but tried desperately to claim a historical triumph anyway.
This involves the Swift and Watson controversy.
Right. In August 1878, two astronomers, Professor Swift and Professor Watson, claimed that during a solar eclipse, they had seen luminous bodies
Potential new planets?
between Mercury and the Sun. And the moment this news broke, Professor Chase rushed to the Journal of the Franklin Institute,
He published 3 screaming announcements.
printed in massive capital letters,
Right.
declaring prediction confirmed and a third verification of prediction.
He aggressively claimed that 5 years prior, he had mathematically predicted these exact intramercurial planets.
And now, Swift and Watson had empirically verified his brilliant math.
But the entire foundation of Professor Chase's triumph depended on the observations of Swift and Watson being accurate and aligned.
Which they weren't.
As Fort reveals through the historical records, they were neither accurate nor aligned. Professor Colbert, who was actually the leader of Swift's own observational party, publicly accused Swift of retroactively altering his observational data to agree with Watson's.
Think about the timeline there. Watson reported seeing one luminous body.
Swift initially claimed he saw 2.
Then, magically, Swift's precise coordinates were adjusted to agree perfectly with Watson's.
But only after Watson's coordinates had been widely published.
It is the academic equivalent of changing your bet after the horse race is already finished.
Exactly. And the kicker is, those bodies they supposedly saw between Mercury and the Sun,
They were never seen again.
if they saw anything at all, it was likely a known star briefly visible during the eclipse, or a comet passing through.
But Professor Chase had already crowed his false raptors to the world. He had already claimed his mathematical crown based on phantom data.
This raises a profoundly important question for you, the listener.
Absolutely.
If you have ever built a financial model, or relied on a political polling forecast, or trusted an algorithmic prediction, you know how fragile those systems can be.
How often do we accept data purely because of the prestige of the source?
We see it published in a respected journal or announced by a recognized institutional authority, and we accept it as objective truth.
While completely ignoring the messy, contradictory, or even scandalous reality operating behind the scenes.
Fort is warning us that the prestige of institutional astronomy, much like modern predictive modeling, is often founded on nothing but huge capital letters, exclamation points, and the sheer audacity of ignoring the misses while heavily publicizing the hits.
That leads us right into the heart of how this system protects itself when things go wrong.
The mathematics of excuse?
If you want to see it in full swing, you have to look at how astronomers handle phenomena that flat out refuse to show up on time.
Shooting stars and failed comets?
Let's look at the Leonids.
In 1833, there was a massive, spectacular meteor shower visible along the Atlantic coast.
It was described as a cloudburst of stars. It was arguably the greatest celestial spectacle of the 19th century.
Naturally, the astronomical priestcraft felt the intense need to formulate this.
They cannot abide a mystery.
They must assert control. So, Professor Olmsted stepped up and demonstrated mathematically that these meteors revolved around the sun once every 6 months.
Which, of course, was completely wrong based on subsequent observations.
So, the baton was passed to Professor Newton.
He stepped in and demonstrated that the real orbital period was 33¼ years.
But it is vital to note how he arrived at that number.
He did it empirically, right?
He just dug through old historical records back to 902 AD and found a recurring temporal pattern.
But as Ford points out, simple historical pattern recognition wasn't divine enough for the scientific establishment.
It lacked the majesty of the calculus.
It had to be mathematical to be revered.
So, Dr. Adams, the very same Adams who failed to point anywhere near Neptune but was still acclaimed as its co-discoverer,
Used his formidable math to mathematically confirm the 33-year period.
he used his equations to predict a massive, spectacular return of the Leonids for November 1866.
And then again for November 1899.
The stage is set. The math has spoken.
So 1866 rolls around.
Yeah.
And it is a complete dud.
At least in England, where the heavy hitters of the astronomical establishment were waiting with their telescopes.
There were some meteors, sure, but absolutely nothing resembling the terrifying cloudburst of 1833.
But the math, the infallible math of Dr. Adams, required a massive display.
The establishment could not admit the math was flawed.
So, Richard Proctor, an astronomer who Fort characterizes as having spent his entire career making excuses for the establishment, publicly claimed that the morning of November 14th, 1867, wasn't clear in England.
That the thick English fog was the only reason they missed the brilliant part of the shower.
It sounds like a perfectly reasonable excuse until someone actually checks the data.
And that is what Fort does better than anyone. He doesn't just accept the excuse. He checks the receipts.
Fort pulls the actual meteorological records for that specific night.
He quotes a report from E.J. Lowe at Highfield House, recording the exact weather conditions.
Clear at 1:10 a.m., sky not covered until 3:10 a.m., sky not overcast until 5:50 a.m.
It was a charming, perfectly clear morning in England during the exact window the meteors were predicted.
The fog didn't hide the meteors simply weren't there.
The narrative of the infallibility of science is cracking.
But the tragedy becomes pure comedy when we reach the 1899 prediction.
Because of the previous hype, no meteoric event in history had ever aroused such widespread public interest.
People were terrified, anticipating the end of the world. Newspapers ran massive features.
The scientific community staked its entire reputation on this return.
And it completely, utterly failed.
There were no Leonids of note in November 1899.
The astronomers scrambled. They told the public they've been delayed slightly. They will be here next year.
So November 1900 comes. Still no Leonids.
Again, the establishment pleads for patience. They will be here next year.
November 1901. Nothing.
The mathematical prophecy, built on the supposed infallibility of celestial mechanics, was a total, humiliating bust.
And this is where we see the ultimate mechanism of the priestcraft at work. The invention of invisible variables to save the theory.
What was the ultimate excuse provided to the public?
Professor Service, in a widely read textbook called Astronomy in a Nutshell, explained that the giant planets Jupiter and Saturn had gravitationally altered the orbits of the meteors, pulling them away from Earth.
I want you to really think about how incredibly convenient that excuse is.
It's too perfect.
For nearly 1,000 years, going all the way back to the historical records of the Crusades through the discovery of the Americas, nothing disturbed the Leonids.
They were perfectly on time, every 33 years.
But the very minute modern Victorian astronomers stake their professional reputations and their mathematical models on predicting them.
Suddenly, Jupiter and Saturn decide to flex their gravitational muscles and pull the entire meteor stream off course.
Fort just laughs at the cosmic playfulness of existence.
The universe seems to possess a deeply ironic sense of humor.
It loves humiliating purists who try to force wild, chaotic nature into neat little mathematical boxes.
It's almost as if the cosmos is actively resisting being formalized.
If we connect this to a broader epistemological theme, it reflects a deep, enduring human tendency to double down on a failed theory rather than endure the ego death of abandoning it.
We see this today in economics, in sociology, in political science.
Instead of an astronomer having the humility to say, my math is wrong, the underlying theory of celestial mechanics might be flawed, they invent invisible, untestable forces.
Jupiter's gravitational pull suddenly interfering out of nowhere becomes a mathematical plug to save their equations.
We see this even more clearly and with even more absurdity with the humiliation of comets.
Comets are the ultimate test of Newtonism, which dictates they must obey the strict law of gravitation.
And the saga of the comets in New Lands is mind-boggling.
The Great Comet of 1848 is perhaps the most glaring example of this theoretical doubling down.
In 1847, a prominent astronomer named Mr. Hind proudly announced to the scientific world that his rigorous calculations satisfied him completely that the Great Comet of 1264 and 1556 would return in February 1848.
He staked his name on it, calling it an impending astronomical triumph.
February 1848 comes and goes. The sky is empty. No comet.
So the establishment panics.
Mr. Barber of Etwell steps in to go over Hind's calculations.
And Barber announces that he has reached back through 3 centuries of complex orbital interactions and discovered that the gravitational pull of Jupiter and Saturn delayed the comet by exactly 488 days.
Stop and consider the sheer arrogance of that claim.
It's astounding.
That is an astronomer working with pencil and paper in the mid-19th century, pretending to have divine, flawless insight into 300 years of infinitely complex multi-body gravitational interactions across billions of miles of space.
And resolving it to an exact figure of 488 days.
It is not science. It is numerical mysticism masquerading as precision.
And the punchline is, despite this incredibly precise, mathematically proven excuse of a 488-day delay, the comet still didn't show up.
Not after 488 days, not after 500 days.
So they just kept calculating and adjusting the goalposts.
Mr. Hind published a pamphlet in 1857 filled with near highly technical excuses, claiming he had corrected the initial data parameters.
He boldly predicted the comet for 1865.
Then, when that looked shaky, he adjusted it to August 1860.
Then, realizing that was wrong, he moved it to 1864.
Then he panicked and moved it back to August 1858.
Another prominent astronomer, Baum, ran his own calculations and declared the absolute return date was August 10, 1858.
No comet.
So they adjusted it again to August 2010, 1860.
Still no comet.
It is just a massive fizzle with a cloud of increasingly desperate mathematical excuses revolving around it.
And then we have the inverse problem.
When a comet does actually show up.
When it does show up, it humiliates them in the opposite way.
On June 30, 1861, a magnificent, terrifying comet appeared in the sky.
It was described as one of the most brilliant luminosities of modern times.
It burst into view suddenly, as if dropped through the very shell of our solar system.
The general public was alarmed. They wrote letters to the newspapers, demanding to know why the great astronomical establishment, with all its predictive math, hadn't seen this gigantic, blazing object coming.
And Mr. Hind, the very same Mr. Hind who couldn't find his own predicted comet, stepped forward to explain.
He stated that the observatories didn't see it coming because it was a small object.
A small object. Fort points out the sheer absurdity of that statement. To the naked eye, the head of this comet was the apparent size of the moon.
It was a massive glowing spectacle dominating the night sky.
Hind claimed it would fade away quickly because it was so insignificant.
Yet observational records show it was still clearly visible in April 1862, nearly a full year later.
The disconnect between the theoretical model and the observational reality is staggering.
You also have the comedy of Edwin Holmes's comet in 1892.
This object appeared, and the world's leading astronomers rushed to formalize it.
Different astronomers, using the exact same infallible Newtonian principles, simultaneously calculated its distance from Earth to be anywhere from 20 million to 200 million miles away.
Its physical diameter was estimated by different experts to be anywhere between 27,000 and 300,000 miles.
Professor Berberich, a highly respected figure, confidently announced that his calculations proved the comet was rapidly approaching Earth and would literally touch our atmosphere on November 21st.
Panic ensued.
What actually happened?
The comet, which subsequent analysis showed had actually been receding from Earth the entire time, just kept on receding peacefully into the distance.
They had literally no idea if the object was coming toward them or moving away from them.
Yet they presented their findings with the absolute certainty of religious dogma.
This constant retroactive fitting of the math to the observation doesn't just apply to missing comets.
Ford found the exact same psychological trap when astronomers started pointing their telescopes at the stars, looking for invisible companions.
This brings us to the phenomenon Fort calls ghosts in the lenses.
This is where Fort takes aim at the concept of dark companions.
Yes, the dark companions. Astronomers love predicting these invisible companions based on supposed gravitational wobbles in a visible star's movement.
If a star appears to shift slightly, they assume a massive dark body is orbiting it and pulling it.
Let's look at the highly publicized case of the star Procyon.
Professor Auwers, a titan of 19th century astronomy, computed the exact orbit of a hypothetical dark companion to Procyon.
He drew a precise circle around the star on a chart, predicting exactly where the companion should be located at any given time.
In 1873, the highly respected Professor Otto Struve looked through his massive telescope at the Pulkovo Observatory and found a distinct point of light exactly where Auwers had predicted it would be.
The ultimate confirmation.
Exactly. Agnes Clerk, a very prominent astronomy writer of the era, recorded that Struve watched this point of light over and over.
He convinced himself it moved precisely in the calculated orbit Auwers had drawn.
An American astronomer even chimed in, claiming he had confirmed the observation and measured the companion's movement.
It was hailed globally as a massive, indisputable triumph of Newtonian mechanics.
A triumph right up until the moment someone actually examined the physical equipment Struve was using.
They took apart Struve's telescope and found a minute optical defect between the lenses.
The telescope itself was creating a fake companion, a literal ghost reflection of light, exactly 10 seconds of arc away from every bright star it was pointed at.
Procyon didn't have a companion. Struve's telescope had a smudge.
And what about the American astronomer who supposedly confirmed it?
Fort notes that he was looking at a completely different, already well-known faint star in the background and just arbitrarily applying Auwers' math to that star.
The companion of Procyon never existed. It was a phantom born of defective glass and wishful thinking.
What is truly fascinating here, and what Fort wants the reader to grasp, is the psychological phenomenon of standardized observation.
These highly trained, supposedly objective observers see exactly what they are professionally incentivized to see.
They are looking for a specific dot in a specific place to validate a colleague's math.
The human brain, aided by the intense, almost desperate desire for a scientific triumph, physically conjures that dot into existence.
They interpret an optical artifact as a celestial body because the theory demands a celestial body.
And we see the exact same psychological mechanism at play with the famous companion of Sirius.
Auwers, again, calculated its theoretical orbit.
In 1862, the renowned telescope maker Alvan Clark turned his newly crafted massive telescope on Sirius and, lo and behold, found the companion precisely where the math dictated it should be.
The astronomical community rejoiced.
Richard Proctor wrote 30 years later that the observed companion had conformed fairly well with the originally calculated orbit.
But Fort, ever the skeptic, pulls the actual long-term observational data.
He cites Flammarion and other independent astronomers who published diagrams showing the originally calculated orbit layered over the actual observed path of the companion over several decades.
They didn't conform at all. The orbital paths were wildly divergent.
In fact, the companion only matched the mathematical prediction on the exact day Alvan Clark first looked for it.
Which prompts Fort to ask a piercing, deeply uncomfortable question. By what miracle of celestial mechanics could that star be in the exact, perfectly predicted spot on the very day they needed it to be there to validate the theory, but never conform to the orbit again?
The answer lies in the less publicized observations of astronomers like Dr. Dawes and Goldschmidt.
They pointed their telescopes at Sirius and found that there wasn't just one faint star in the vicinity. There were at least 6 faint stars scattered around the primary star.
Fort strongly implies, based on the evidence, that Alvan Clark simply looked through his powerful new telescope, saw half a dozen faint points of light in the general area, and arbitrarily selected the one that happened to be at the required mathematical distance to declare victory,
completely ignoring the existence of the others.
It's an incredible revelation. Fort is showing us how scientific consensus, the bedrock of our accepted reality, is sometimes just an agreed-upon hallucination.
It operates like an exclusive club where the primary directive is to protect the established narrative and the reputations of its senior members at all costs.
To really grasp this club mentality, you have to look at the scandalous story of Herbert Sadler and the Bedford Catalog.
The Bedford Catalog was a highly celebrated, supposedly definitive book of double stars compiled by Admiral Smith.
The Astronomer Royal himself publicly called it a work of sterling merit.
It was the gold standard of observational astronomy.
But in 1879, Herbert Sadler, a relatively new fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, had the audacity to read a paper pointing out some discrepancies.
And the establishment's reaction was not to engage with his data, but to destroy him.
It was swift and brutal.
A senior astronomer named Chambers led a vicious attack on Sadler during a meeting.
He demanded Sadler resign from the society immediately for the crime of slandering a great established man.
The Society's council actually published formal regrets that they had even allowed Sadler's paper to be read into the record, claiming he had no evidence and was merely insulting a titan of the field.
They tried to excommunicate him for heresy.
But Sadler refused to back down. He fought back with hard data.
He published a meticulously detailed list of 50 gross and stupid errors in Smith's revered catalog and stated he easily could have listed 250 more.
He demonstrated, for example, that in one specific set of 167 observations recorded by Smith, 117 of them were completely factually wrong.
And Sadler was eventually vindicated, wasn't he?
S.W. Burnham, an immensely respected observer, came forward and validated Sadler's claims, publishing 30 pages of documented undeniable errors in Smith's book.
Even after another establishment astronomer desperately tried to defend Smith's legacy, there were still 13 solid pages of undeniably stupid, basic observational errors left in this supposed standard textbook of astronomy.
It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the observational data underlying these grand mathematical theories is often shockingly sloppy, and the institutions will protect the sloppiness to maintain their authority.
My personal favorite example of how the establishment enforces this conventionality of observation involves Andrew Barclay.
He was a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society in Scotland.
In 1893, Barclay published a series of sketches depicting exactly what he saw through his telescope's speculum mirror.
He didn't draw the perfect, smooth orbs the textbooks demanded.
He drew Jupiter as looking like a lumpy muskmelon with rows of bunions on it.
He drew Saturn shaped like a bizarre, asymmetrical mushroom.
And the establishment's reaction was predictable.
They mocked him mercilessly, dismissing him as having crazy hallucinations and implying he was losing his mind.
But Barclay's underlying point, which Ford champions, is profound.
Barclay argued that telescopes are inherently flawed instruments, and they are tested and calibrated entirely by the conventionality of their disclosures.
If you look through a lens and see the smooth, perfect, mathematically predictable spheres that the establishment says should be there, your telescope is declared excellent and your observation sound.
If you look through that same lens and draw the distorted, bizarre reality of what the light actually looks like when it hits a flawed speculum mirror, you are called crazy.
You are punished for reporting your raw perception instead of conforming to the agreed-upon hallucination.
That concept of the agreed-upon hallucination is the perfect bridge to the most radical part of Fort's critique.
Having demonstrated that the observations are sloppy, the math is retroactive, and the institutions are deeply biased, Fort takes his critique all the way down to the foundational premises of astronomy.
He attacks the very base of the house of cards.
He asks a question so simple it seems absurd to the modern mind. How do we actually empirically know that the Earth moves?
It feels like heresy to even ask that today.
We are taught from childhood that Copernicus proved the Earth moves around the sun, overthrowing the dark ages of the geocentric model.
But Fort systematically points out that Copernicus had absolutely zero mathematical or empirical proof for a moving Earth.
None.
He didn't have advanced telescopes. He didn't have stellar parallax data.
He simply proposed the heliocentric model because he felt it was a simpler geometric concept than the wildly complex epicycles of the Ptolemaic system.
The entire foundation of modern astronomy was built on a philosophical, aesthetic preference for geometric simplicity, not on hard, undeniable physical evidence.
Fort argues that modern astronomers prefer to study the unimaginably remote cosmos, precisely because it is safe from external, independent inquiry.
They can confidently tell the public what specific gases are burning in a star trillions of miles away, and no one can travel there to prove them wrong.
But when challenged, they struggle to mathematically prove the most rudimentary physical facts about our own localized environment.
Take the physical shape of the Earth. Fort brings up the fascinating, almost surreal Bedford Canal bet from 1870 to illustrate how shaky the local math is.
The Bedford Canal bet is incredible. You have John Hampden, a staunch flat earther, who publicly bet 500 pounds, a massive sum at the time, that the Earth was flat.
He chose the Bedford Canal in England for the test because it features a perfectly straight, unimpeded 6-mile stretch of water.
Now, if you were sitting at home, think about the geometry. According to Orthodox mathematical models of the Earth's curvature, an object viewed from 6 miles away should be visually depressed or hidden by exactly 288 inches, which is about 24 feet of curvature.
Hampton set up a target, looked through a telescope placed just above the water level, and claimed he could see the entire target clearly.
He couldn't see the expected 24-foot curvature depression.
The famous naturalist, Dr. Alfred Russel Wallace, took the bet on behalf of Orthodox science.
They hired a referee, looked through the optics, and Wallace was declared the winner, claiming the curvature was indeed visible.
But Hampton went to his grave screaming he had been defrauded by optical tricks.
And the truly compelling part of Fort's inclusion of this story isn't about flat Earth theory per se, but about what happened decades later.
At the 1901 meeting of the highly prestigious British Association for the Advancement of Science, a researcher named H. Ewell Oldham presented a series of clear photographs taken along that exact same 6-mile stretch of the Bedford Canal.
And in those photographs, everything that should have been hidden behind 24 feet of curvature was perfectly undeniably visible.
Orthodox science explains this away today using the concept of atmospheric refraction.
They claim the atmosphere bent the light perfectly around the curvature of the Earth to make the hidden objects visible.
But Fort would look at that explanation and laugh.
He would say, "Look at what you are doing. You are inventing a magical, perfectly calibrated atmospheric distortion to save your geometric model, just like you invented Jupiter's gravity to save your missing meteors."
It highlights the deep unreliability of the astronomer's primary foundational tool for measuring distance and curvature, triangulation.
Exactly. Astronomers claim to use complex geometric triangulation to definitively measure the distance to stars that are supposedly trillions of miles away.
But Fort asks a devastatingly practical question. To what degree can triangulation be relied upon as an objective tool?
He points out that it fails spectacularly and consistently, even here on the surface of the Earth, where we can actually verify the results.
He cites the historical attempts by different explorers to use rigorous triangulation to measure the height of the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii.
Captain Cook's expedition calculated it at 18,410 feet.
Marchand's expedition calculated it at 16,611 feet.
Commodore Wilkes calculated it at 13,761 feet.
That is a variance of nearly a full mile in a local measurement.
Fort notes that similar, wildly varying estimates exist for the triangulation of Mount Everest. Fort's conclusion is brutal. He says, "There is not an astronomer in the world who can tell the distance of a thing only 5 miles away."
Yet these same individuals confidently tell us the moon is exactly 240,000 miles away.
As Fort jokes, based on the unreliability of their tools, it might be 240 miles away, or it might be 240 million miles away.
Which brings us to the ultimate example of scientists colluding to prop up their shaky math: the speed of light and the calculated distance to the sun.
This is where Fort exposes what he brilliantly terms a tainted agreement among the scientific elite.
The history of calculating the distance to the sun is a history of wild guesses holding hands with other wild guesses.
Early astronomical pioneers like Romer and Huygens were essentially just guessing distances to make their localized orbital models function.
Huygens arbitrarily guessed the sun was about 100 million miles away. Later, an astronomer named Encke used what Fort calls worthless and highly inconsistent observations of the transit of Venus to declare definitively that the sun was exactly 95 million miles away.
It became the accepted gospel.
And then the physicists got involved. They needed to measure the velocity of light.
A physicist named Delambre ran complex calculations and miraculously determined that the speed of light was a figure that perfectly, seamlessly matched Encke's 95 million mile distance to the sun.
The scientific community patted themselves on the back for this beautiful convergence of independent data.
But the convergence was a lie.
Decades later, astronomers realized their mathematical models regarding the sun's slight oscillations were fundamentally wrong.
To make the new mathematical models work, they desperately needed the sun to be closer to the Earth.
They needed it to be about 91 million miles away instead of 95.
The entire astronomical paradigm was in danger of collapsing if the distance didn't change.
And what do you know? Right on cue, a physicist named Foucault ran a new, supposedly independent laboratory experiment using spinning mirrors.
And Foucault miraculously discovered that the speed of light was actually slower than previously thought.
And the new speed of light exactly matched the new 91 million mile distance the astronomers desperately needed to save their models.
Fort calls this amiable complacence.
It is not the objective pursuit of truth. It is a social agreement among institutional scientists to keep the house of cards standing.
When the astronomers need the sun to be closer, the physicists magically find that light travels slower, so the equations still balance.
They are just tweaking the variables to align with the desired outcome.
Based on this, Fort completely dismisses the revered frameworks of Keplerism and Newtonism as mere architecture.
He points out that Kepler derived his famous laws of planetary motion by assuming the Earth moved, which was unproven, and by applying raw observational data from Tycho Brahe.
But Tycho Brahe used that exact same observational data to mathematically prove the Earth was completely stationary.
The data didn't dictate the model. The philosophical assumption dictated how the data was used.
And Newton, the ultimate demigod of science, is treated as infallible because he supposedly watched an apple fall and brilliantly invented the concept of universal attraction.
But Fort's critique of Newton is breathtaking in its simplicity and its logic.
Fort says, yes, Newton saw an apple fall toward the Earth, and his mind conceived of a universal pulling force, attraction.
But, Fort argues, had Newton tried to take a juicy bone away from a hungry dog, he would have experienced an entirely different, equally powerful force.
And had he based his cosmology on that experience, he would have been quite as well justified in explaining the entire universe in terms of universal repulsion.
It is a brilliant philosophical point. Mathematics can be engineered to model absolutely anything if you're allowed to set the initial parameters and invent the invisible forces.
It is pure architecture.
A mathematically balanced equation does not prove that the forces described in the equation actually exist in physical reality.
If you, the listener, have ever sat in a corporate boardroom or a political briefing and felt intimidated by a massive complex spreadsheet or a dense slide deck filled with impenetrable jargon and precise decimal points, Fort is speaking directly to you right now.
He is reminding you that sometimes the underlying premises of those incredibly complex, intimidating models are just guesses holding hands with other guesses.
The internal math of the spreadsheet might be flawless, but if the foundational assumption in cell A1 is a wild guess, the entire magnificent structure is a fantasy.
Having meticulously torn down this house of cards, having exposed the priestcraft, the tainted agreements, and the mathematics of excuse, Fort doesn't just leave us in a void of skepticism.
He offers his own alternative model.
And it is a stunning, radical reimagining of reality. He calls it his neo-astronomy.
And he begins building this model not with complex equations, but with a massive, undeniable observational anomaly. The stars have not changed their relative positions in over 2,000 years.
The constellations you see tonight look exactly the same as they did to the ancient Greeks charting them on parchment.
Orthodox astronomy tells us this is because the stars are unimaginably, terrifyingly far away.
They claim the stars are trillions upon trillions of miles distant, so even though they're moving at incredible speeds, their movements are imperceptible to us from our vantage point.
But Ford applies Occam's razor. He asks, what if they haven't changed position relative to us because they aren't far away at all?
What if they are very, very close?
He points to phenomena like the Gegenschein, which is a faint, round patch of light, sometimes visible in the night sky opposite the sun.
Astronomers admit it has no discernible parallax, meaning its distance can't be triangulated against background stars.
Ford argues the Gegenschein isn't some distant cloud of dust. It's actually reflected sunlight bouncing off the inner, physical surface of a solid, enclosing celestial shell that closely surrounds the Earth.
The most compelling, rigorous observational data Fort uses to build this theory of a close enclosing shell is Denning's meteors.
In 1878, a highly respected observer named W.F. Denning presented a meticulous paper on meteor radiance.
A radiant is simply the specific point in the night sky from which a shower of meteors appears to originate.
Think of looking down a long set of parallel railroad tracks. They appear to originate from a single vanishing point.
Denning cataloged 22 specific meteor radiants that maintain their exact position relative to a specific constellation for months at a time.
This is a profound paradigm-breaking anomaly if you accept the Orthodox model.
If the Earth is ripping through space around the Sun, and the constellations are just optical illusions made of stars trillions of miles away, a meteor stream shouldn't perfectly track with a background constellation for months.
Fort's analogy to explain why this is so devastating to the Orthodox model is absolute perfection. I want you to visualize this.
Imagine you are standing in a small seacoast town.
You look out over the water, and you see a ship slowly sailing past the town, parallel to the coast.
As the ship sails, it is firing artillery shells.
All the shells explode in the air, exactly halfway between the ship and the town.
As the ship continues to move down the coast, the point in the air where the shells explode moves right along with it, tracking perfectly with the ship.
If you were standing in that town observing this, the only logical, rational conclusion you can reach is that the ship is relatively close by, and the ship itself is the physical source firing the shells.
Now apply that exact same irrefutable logic to Denning's meteors.
If a meteor shower appears to originate from the constellation Leo, and it keeps originating from Leo night after night, month after month, even as the constellation Leo slowly moves across the night sky, then the constellation Leo must be the physical source of the meteors.
And for a constellation to be the physical source of rocks and debris hitting the Earth, that constellation cannot be a random assortment of suns trillions of miles away.
It must be a cohesive physical structure that is relatively close to us.
Therefore, the stars and the constellations are close.
Which brings us to Fort's ultimate, breathtaking vision of the cosmos. He calls it the geosystem.
He envisions our reality as a super-embryonic thing.
Forget the terrifying, infinite void of space filled with dead rocks.
In Fort's neo-astronomy, the Earth is not a meaningless speck of dust. It is a stationary, vital nucleus.
The sky above us is not an empty vacuum. It is a revolving, protective, physical shell.
The stars we see are not distant, massive suns. They are literally pores or functional channels in that enclosing shell, emitting light from some unimaginable external existence that lies entirely outside the egg.
It is a complete radical inversion of our entire cosmology.
It replaces a dead mechanical universe with a biological developing one.
In Fort's model, the planets are what he calls circulating adjacencies.
They're relatively close, minor bodies moving around the central nucleus of the Earth, performing some function we don't fully understand.
The entire system, the Earth, the planets, the enclosing starry shell is incubating.
We are walled away, protected from the rest of the wider cosmos, functioning exactly like a developing chick growing inside the protective shell of an egg.
And the truly wild part is that Fort backs up this poetic vision with the most bizarre, meticulously cataloged observational data.
Data that the astronomical priestcraft actively suppresses because it ruins their math.
Take the little black stones of Birmingham.
Fort cites numerous reports that over an 11-year period, strange, identical little black stones repeatedly fell from the sky onto the exact same small town of Birmingham, England.
Fort asks the obvious mechanical question. If the Earth is spinning on its axis at 1,000 miles an hour and simultaneously ripping through the solar system at 19 miles a second, how is it physically possible for a random meteor stream floating in the vacuum of space to repeatedly drop stones on the exact same tiny rotating coordinate on the Earth's surface over the course of a decade?
It's mechanically impossible in the Orthodox model.
But it makes perfect sense if it implies a stationary Earth and a fixed, solid structure hovering relatively close just above us in the revolving shell, dropping debris from a specific point.
Fort catalogs hundreds of these localized anomalous phenomena.
He documents strange, unknown vegetable matter falling from the sky in specific regions.
He notes symmetrical, heavily manufactured-looking stones falling in isolated areas.
He records repeated observations of targeted flashes of light that look suspiciously like deliberate signals originating from the moon or Venus.
By standardizing all of these bizarre events as merely unusual meteors or freak auroras, the scientific exclusionism blinds us to the thrilling possibility that these are actually interactions with nearby physical lands.
Fort calls them the San Salvadors of the sky.
Unexplored continents sitting right above our heads, just out of our current reach, within the confines of our protective shell.
We have covered incredible mind-bending ground today.
We have traced Fort's meticulous, relentless dismantling of the so-called absolute demonstrations of the astronomical priestcraft.
We've exposed how the revered mathematics is often just flexible architecture built on a foundation of arbitrary guesses.
We've laughed at the desperate, shifting excuses used to explain away missing comets and failing meteor showers.
We've looked at the optical illusions of dark companions and the highly suspicious, tainted agreements used to define the speed of light.
And finally, we've visualized Fort's breathtaking alternative paradigm, the Earth as the stationary incubating center of a superembryonic cosmic egg.
So stepping back from all of this incredible data, what does this all truly mean for us, the modern learner?
It means that the pursuit of true knowledge requires a relentless, uncompromising willingness to question authority, no matter how prestigious that authority may seem.
It means we must constantly, vigilantly challenge the exclusionism of dogmatic science, which seeks to discard anything it cannot neatly explain.
We must maintain the courage to stay radically open to the wild, the bizarre, and the anomalous data that absolutely refuses to fit into the neat, sterile textbook models.
Because history shows us, time and time again, that the suppressed anomalous data is precisely where the next massive leap in human understanding lies waiting to be discovered.
And before we end this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought.
Something to let simmer in your mind the next time you find yourself standing outside, looking up at the vastness of the night sky.
Building directly upon Fort's concept of the superembryonic geosystem, this idea of us being walled off from the wider unknown universe inside a protective shell, I want you to consider the fundamental biological law of embryos.
A protective shell, in nature, only exists for a very specific temporary period.
It exists to nurture and protect the fragile organism inside only until that organism is fully developed, aware, and finally ready to survive the harsh realities of the outside world.
If our Earth is indeed a developing conscious nucleus, and the starry sky above us is our temporary protective shell, what happens when we finally reach our cosmic maturity?
Are the anomalous repeating flashes of light, the strange localized sounds, and the unexplainable falling stones that Fort so carefully cataloged merely random debris?
Or are they the methodical tapping of something immense from the outside, signaling to us, waiting patiently for the cosmic egg to finally crack open?
Now that is a thought that will fundamentally change how you view the stars tonight.
Thank you for joining us on this custom-tailored deep dive into part 1 of Charles Fort's New Lands. Keep looking up, keep relentlessly questioning the consensus, and never, ever stop exploring the new lands of your own curiosity. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to another deep dive. Pull up a chair, get comfortable.
Yeah, and maybe grab a notebook.
Right, definitely a notebook. Because today we are embarking on, an absolute mind-bender of a journey.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah. And when I say mind-bender, I mean we are about to take a metaphorical sledgehammer to the very foundations of how you perceive the world.
The sky above you.
Exactly, the sky above you, your place in the universe. I am talking about Charles Fort's profoundly unsettling, wildly controversial book, New Lands.
It is quite a trip.
It really is. Now, for you, our insanely curious third friend sitting here in the room with us, who hates being bogged down by impenetrable jargon and just wants to get to the good stuff.
You hear you.
I have some great news.
Right.
Based on the focus we decided on for this text, we are completely skipping part 1.
Oh, thank goodness.
Right, we are throwing it out the window.
Which is, frankly, a massive relief for all of us. Part 1 of New Lands is essentially Fort launching this relentless, mathematically dense critique against the Orthodox astronomy of his time.
It's just page after page of orbital complaints.
Literally. He spends chapters dissecting the incredibly messy, often contradictory calculations of 19th century astronomers, people like Leverrier and Adams.
Yeah.
He tries to point out that their supposed mathematical triumphs, discovering new planets, were really just accidental finds dressed up as predictive genius.
Which is an interesting historical critique, sure.
Sure, in its own right. But it is incredibly dry, and honestly, it is not the main event of what makes Charles Fort so legendary.
Exactly. So we are cutting through the thicket of celestial mechanics. We were jumping straight into the meat of the text. For this deep dive, the focus and the conversation are going to be strictly on part 2 of the source book.
Going direct to the subjects.
Back to the subjects. We are diving into the bizarre events, the unexplainable atmospheric phenomena, and the wild, sweeping theories that Fort uses to challenge the entirety of conventional science.
We're looking at the sky not as an empty, lifeless void,
But as a vibrant, populated, and sometimes terrifyingly interactive space.
and that brings us directly to the core premise of Part 2, a concept that Fort coins as extrageography.
Extrageography.
Yeah. I want you, listening right now, to completely discard your mental model of the solar system for a moment.
Just throw it out.
Forget the textbooks you had in elementary school. Forget the globes sitting in classrooms. Fort asks a very simple, very dangerous question. What if the sky isn't an empty, freezing vacuum separating us from distant, isolated rocks?
It's not empty at all.
Right. What if instead the sky is a populated physical landscape? And here is the truly dizzying part of his premise, the part that completely breaks conventional physics.
Brace yourself.
What if the Earth isn't spinning and ripping through space at 19 miles a second? What if the Earth is instead entirely stationary and there are other worlds, literal islands of space, hovering just miles above our heads?
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yes.
Because my brain is already throwing up a million red flags.
I don't blame you.
We are taught from childhood that the Earth is a globe hurtling through the cosmos. I mean, we have satellite imagery today. We have pendulums. We have basic Newtonian physics.
We do.
But it's important to remember that Fort is compiling this in the early 20th century. And he is looking at centuries of documented, observable data that he claims conventional science just sweeps under the rug.
He's essentially saying, wait a minute.
Yeah.
If you look at the raw data of what is physically happening in our atmosphere, the math of a moving Earth does not match the reality of what is falling on our heads.
That is the crux of his argument, right?
It is. Fort operates as an accumulator of anomalies. He spends decades in libraries pulling newspaper clippings, meteorological reports, scientific journals.
Just obsessively collecting data.
And he introduces this critical question, which forms the core paradox of Part 2. He says, let's assume the astronomers are right. Let's assume the Earth is ripping through space at 19 miles a second.
Which is what, about 67,000 miles an hour around the sun?
Roughly, yes. While simultaneously rotating at about 1,000 miles an hour at the equator.
It's incredibly fast.
Unfathomable speeds, traversing millions of miles of empty space. So his question is, how is it physically possible for things to fall from the sky or appear in the sky in the exact same local area over and over again?
Right, because just thinking about the basic logistics of that,
Yeah.
if we are moving that fast, anything dropping from a stationary point in space, or even moving in its own orbit, would be left behind instantly by the Earth.
Instantly.
Or if it somehow managed to hit us while we were moving at 67,000 miles an hour, it would be smashed into microscopic dust by the sheer impact of the velocity.
It's like trying to drop a pebble from a highway overpass.
Into a specific teacup.
Yes, a teacup sitting on a bullet train that's speeding underneath.
You might hit the train, maybe, if you're lucky,
Mm.
but you are not hitting the teacup.
No.
And you certainly aren't hitting the teacup 4 times in a row over the span of a decade.
That analogy perfectly isolates the mechanical absurdity that Fort is trying to highlight. If the Earth is a bullet train, then localized, repeating phenomena should be impossible.
Period.
And Fort doesn't just ask this as a fun theoretical puzzle. He brings an avalanche of geographic data to back up his premise. He wants to show that the bullet train theory has holes in it.
So let's get into that data.
Oh, yeah.
Because this is where Fort's research gets really weird. Let's talk about what we can call the London Triangle.
Okay.
Fort maps out a very specific, highly localized region in England. He draws this out using historical reports.
Mm-hmm.
It's pointed in the north by Worcester and Hereford,
Right.
in the south by Reading, which is in Berkshire, and in the east by Colchester in Essex. And right through the line between Colchester and Reading, you have London.
A very defined area.
Very defined. And in this highly specific, localized geographic triangle, over the span of several years, the sky essentially keeps erupting.
The repeating detonations over Reading are a prime example of this data set. Fort tracks these booming sounds. Witnesses consistently describe them as sounding like heavy, concussive artillery echoing down from the sky.
And these weren't isolated one-off events, right?
Not at all. There was a specific, terrifying series of these detonations in November of 1888. They were heard on November 19th, then again on the 20th, and again on the 21st.
3 days in a row.
The concussions were so intense that they didn't just rattle windows, they caused massive, widespread animal panics.
Oh, wow.
Fort cites agricultural reports detailing how, in a tract of land 25 miles long and 8 miles wide, thousands of sheep burst from their bounds.
Just from the sound.
by a simultaneous impulse of sheer terror. Farmers found them the next morning panting under hedges, completely traumatized.
And as a skeptic, my first thought is, okay, it's 1888 in England. It's the height of the British Empire. They have a massive military. So what did the authorities say?
They officially dismissed it as artillery practice.
Right, of course.
They claimed it was big guns being fired at Portsmouth or Milford.
But here is where Fort's obsessive research comes in. He doesn't just accept the official excuse. He digs into the actual military records of the time.
Yes, he does.
And he finds that investigators from the period actually checked. There was absolutely no big gun firing happening at those naval bases or anywhere else in England that could account for those sounds on those specific dates.
Not at all.
The sounds were genuinely coming from the sky. And the kicker is they were repeating over the exact same localized area day after day.
Which forces us right back to his central paradox. If the Earth is rotating and revolving, tracing this massive, complex corkscrew path through the solar system,
a source of explosions in the vacuum of space would have to perfectly miraculously track the Earth's compound movements just to keep booming over Reading, Berkshire 3 days in a row.
it would have to anticipate our rotation and our orbit. To conventional science, it's either a sheer astronomically impossible coincidence, or it's just a local thunderstorm they misidentified.
But Ford argues the data is too consistent.
And then he layers on even more data, moving from ephemeral sounds to hard, physical objects hitting the ground.
Yes, the falling stones.
Yeah.
This is where the bullet train analogy completely shatters.
Absolutely.
If sounds are hard to track, physical rocks are impossible to ignore. Fort recounts these reports of little black stones falling in towns like Birmingham and Wolverhampton.
Now, a meteor shower happens, right? We know rocks fall from space.
Sure, but Fort's data shows these stones didn't fall just once or twice. 4 separate times over a period of 11 years, these specific, identically described black stones fall from the sky onto the exact same localized part of the Earth's surface in England.
And it's not just an old 19th century English phenomenon either. Fort tracks this pattern globally. He brings up an incident in Chico, California in 1922.
I love this one.
Picture this. It's a completely cloudless sky in California. Suddenly, smooth rocks begin falling from the empty air, hitting a very specific area. And this happens intermittently for days. They're hitting the exact same localized spot in this town. Police were called. They searched the area for pranksters with catapults. They found nothing.
The rocks were just materializing from above.
Right. So if we take Fort's premise, how on earth does he explain this mechanically? Because to me, it sounds like he's describing a glitch in a video game.
Fort's mechanical explanation requires that total paradigm shift we talked about. Think of it this way. Imagine you have a hose, spraying water onto a spinning globe in your living room.
Okay.
The water doesn't hit a single fixed point on the plastic sphere. As the globe turns, the water leaves a long, wet line across the surface.
Obviously.
Therefore, Fort suggests, the origin point of these stones in Birmingham or Chico cannot be a random meteor shower from the deep vacuum of space. The Earth's rotation would spread those impacts across continents.
It would leave a line of rocks.
Exactly. Instead, the source must be a fixed island of space. And for that island to drop stones on the exact same spot over a decade, the Earth must be completely stationary relative to that island.
The island is literally hovering right above Birmingham.
It's hovering right above Chico.
It is a completely wild, almost hallucinatory conclusion.
Yeah.
But when you follow his internal logic, when you look strictly at the localized data he presents, you can see exactly how he gets there.
You really can.
If something is hovering over Birmingham for 11 years, dropping rocks, and the rocks always hit Birmingham, then Earth cannot be flying around the sun. It has to be standing still.
Now, obviously, modern science has a million ways to disprove the stationary Earth, from the Coriolis effect to stellar parallax.
Right.
But what fascinates me is how Fort highlights the blind spots of science.
This raises an important question, which is really the philosophical heart of Fort's critique. How does conventional science handle data that completely defies the established moving Earth model? What do they do with the Chico rocks or the Reading explosions?
According to Fort, they just ignore it. They shove it in a drawer.
Or they come up with increasingly desperate, convoluted terrestrial explanations to make the anomaly go away.
If a rock falls from a clear sky, they'll blame a local quarry explosion, even if there isn't a quarry for 50 miles.
If there are massive booms, they blame a phantom military drill.
If there's weird weather, it's a distant thunderstorm playing acoustic tricks. They will do absolutely anything to avoid looking up and admitting that the model might be flawed.
Because looking up and genuinely accepting that anomalous data means accepting that our foundational mental model of reality is entirely wrong.
Right.
It means the safety of the known universe is an illusion, and that profound psychological resistance, that sheer terror of the unknown, is the perfect bridge into Fort's next major theme in Part 2.
It's not just about the physical objects, the rocks and the booms that fall from the sky. It's about what we actually see in the sky.
And how our human brains violently reject anything that is incomprehensible. Fort develops this incredibly sophisticated psychological theory regarding what he calls the assimilation of the unknown.
This part blew my mind. He argues that when humans see something in the sky that completely shatters their understanding of reality, say a hovering island or an unknown aerial vessel.
Their brains essentially short-circuit.
Yes. To prevent a total psychological collapse, a kind of existential panic, our perception physically alters what we're seeing. We filter the inexplicable anomaly through familiar, preconceived concepts.
If we see a massive metallic space station, our brain can't process it, so we call it a weirdly shaped cloud or a divine angel.
If we see an alien conflict, we call it a local battle mirage.
It is an evolutionary survival mechanism. We map the terrifying unknown onto the comforting known. And Fort applies this psychological filter to the widespread, historically documented phenomena of phantom cities appearing in the sky.
Now, we've all seen clouds that look vaguely like castles or faces, but Fort is pulling reports of distinct, highly detailed architectural mirages that persist for hours, witnessed by entire towns.
The reports he pulls are staggering. Let's look at the Youghal, Ireland incident.
Oh, the Youghal incident.
In 1801, a massive mirage appeared in the sky over this Irish town, and it wasn't just a fuzzy shape. Witnesses described a detailed walled town complete with mansions and a distinct forest behind it.
A forest in the sky.
It hung in the sky for over an hour. And Fort notes this wasn't even the first time. Similar walled towns had appeared in the exact same spot in 1796 and 1797.
Then you have the incident in Ashland, Ohio in 1890. A massive, unknown city appears hovering in the sky. The locals were completely baffled. They couldn't comprehend an extra-geographic city, so their brains went to work assimilating it.
Naturally.
The secular folks decided it must be a complex atmospheric reflection of Sandusky, which was 60 miles away. But the deeply religious folks, they looked at the exact same anomaly and declared it was a divine vision of the New Jerusalem.
They took a completely alien architectural structure and assimilated it into either their local geography or their theology.
It's the ultimate projection.
The Alaskan Mystery is perhaps the most heavily documented example of these phantom cities in Fort's archives. Over a remote glacier in Alaska, a repeating city would appear in the sky.
It was so consistent, so physically present, that it was actually known to the local indigenous populations for generations before European settlers arrived.
It wasn't a passing cloud. A prospector named Willoughby allegedly photographed it in 1887. Think about the primitive nature of photography in 1887. Capturing a mirage requires an incredibly solid, persistent optical phenomenon.
You can't just snap a quick blurry photo back then.
No, it takes time. Another explorer, Miner Bruce, investigated it and corroborated the sightings. A photographer named Tabor even claimed to have photographed it using a pan of quicksilver to capture the reflection.
And the resulting image showed distinct architecture. A Colosseum-like structure and a prominent mosque-like building.
And what was the official scientific explanation generated to make this anomaly go away? Experts claimed it was a mirage of Bristol, England.
Wait, I have to stop you there. Bristol, England.
Yeah.
Showing up over a glacier in Alaska. That is halfway across the planet.
I know.
The optical physics required to bend light from Bristol across the Atlantic Ocean, across the entire North American continent, and project it perfectly over an Alaskan glacier is vastly more absurd than just saying there's a city in the sky.
Exactly. Fort points out that the scientific desperation to explain it away is palpable. The rational explanation requires a suspension of physics that borders on magic.
It's ridiculous.
Fort breaks down this orthodox view with devastating, almost mocking logic. He argues these are not far-refracted, magically bending reflections of earthly cities thousands of miles away.
Fort speculates that these phenomena are exactly what they appear to be. Glimpses of actual physical structures in the sky.
They are the San Salvadors of the sky.
Lands and cities suspended just above our atmosphere, occasionally becoming visible when atmospheric conditions allow.
And according to his sources, it is not just architecture we are seeing. It is living creatures.
Yes. Fort suggests there is an entire ecosystem of space fauna. There's a report from 1878 in Parkersburg, West Virginia. Local farmers looked up and saw what they described as an opaque white horse swimming in the clear atmosphere about half a mile up.
Now, obviously, it probably wasn't a literal equine horse.
Right. But what else does a 19th century farmer call a four-legged, vaguely biological shape swimming through the sky?
What's fascinating here is how the cultural filter immediately acts as a translator. The unknown biological entity, or perhaps a strange space vessel, is violently forced into the mold of local terrestrial context.
Fort highlights an incredible case from 1843 in Warwick, Canada.
Oh, the Warwick Angels.
The man named Charles Cooper is outside, and he sees three perfectly white, human-like forms sailing in the air beneath a cloud. He notes they are making a loud, mournful, moaning noise.
And Fort focuses on one crucial mechanical detail in Cooper's report. These figures had belts around their bodies.
Belts. That is such a specific, non-divine detail. It sounds like they were strapped into some kind of aeronautical harness, or maybe they were suspended from a vessel that was hidden inside the cloud above them.
It sounds mechanical.
Precisely. It sounds like a rudimentary description of a parachute harness or an EVA suit. But how was this event interpreted by the local community in 1843?
They were immediately deemed to be angels. The community assimilated the data.
A local spiritualist even arrived, investigated the event, and concluded it was a glorious divine sign of the resurrection of the soul.
An alien visitation, possibly a scouting party dropped from an extrageographic ship, becomes a local religious revelation simply because the local culture lacks the vocabulary for extraterrestrial aeronautics.
It is exactly what Arthur C. Clarke said. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, or in this case, theology.
And Fort points out that this assimilation happens with conflicts, too. Our neighbors in the sky aren't always peaceful.
In 1744, in Scotland, 27 different witnesses, some of whom actually gave sworn testimony to a magistrate, saw troops of soldiers maneuvering in the sky over a mountain. And they watched this for 2 solid hours.
The noted physicist of the time, David Brewster, tried to explain it away as a mirage of British troops who were secretly maneuvering on the other side of the mountain to hide from the locals.
Which, as Fort gleefully points out, is an absolutely terrible way to keep a secret military maneuver hidden, projecting your secret army into the sky like a billboard for everyone to see.
Brewster's explanation is a perfect example of a scientist stretching terrestrial physics to the breaking point, just to avoid admitting the existence of the extrageographic, and we see the exact same psychological assimilation in America.
Right. The Brooklyn Eagle report.
Fort pulls this report detailing a massive mirage seen over Lewiston, Montana in 1892. The locals looked up and saw what they described as Indians and frontier hunters battling in the sky.
They reported seeing incredibly specific details. Hunters tied to stakes and faggots of wood being piled up around them for a fire.
The local newspaper even felt the need to note, so far as could be ascertained last night, the Indians on the reservations are peaceable.
It is almost comical when you step back and look at it. A massive cosmic struggle, perhaps an interstellar skirmish, or the movements of a massive space armada hovering over Montana gets filtered perfectly through the lens of the American Wild West.
They saw cowboys and Indians in the sky because that is literally all the observers in 1890s Montana knew how to see.
It highlights a profound limitation in human perception that Fort is warning us about. If we are constantly surrounded by extra-geographic activity ships, fauna, conflicts, we are functionally blind to it.
We immediately strip it of its alien nature and dress it in comfortable, familiar clothes.
But Ford goes on to suggest that sometimes these neighbors in the sky aren't just accidentally showing up in our atmosphere or unintentionally dropping rocks. Sometimes they're actively, desperately trying to communicate with us.
Which brings us to Fort's theories on the moon. And if you thought the stationary Earth was a tough pill to swallow, you need to buckle up for his data on the proximity of the moon.
Ford completely rejects the astronomical consensus. He actually cites George Bernard Shaw, of our people, who made a determination that the moon is only 37 miles away.
37 miles.
That is the distance from a suburb to downtown. That drastically opposes the conventional Newcomb measurement of 240,000 miles. When I read that, I had to stop. 37 miles.
It's shockingly close.
Commercial airplanes cruise at around 7 miles up. He's saying the moon is just a little further up than a transcontinental flight, How on earth does he justify the basic physics of that without the moon crashing into us?
Fort's justification is less about proving the exact mechanics of a 37-mile orbit and more about highlighting the extreme fragility and internal contradictions of astronomic mathematics.
Okay.
He points out a glaring logical flaw in the 240,000-mile model. Astronomers of his day and ours observe lunar craters that are 60 miles wide, sometimes twice that.
Right.
But on Earth, the absolute largest volcanic craters are barely a fraction of that size, maybe 3 or 4 miles across. So Fort argues if the moon is 240,000 miles away and those craters are truly that massive, either lunar gravity is incredibly, unbelievably weak to allow for such massive volcanic casting without collapsing.
Or, and this is his preferred theory, our distance measurements are entirely catastrophically wrong. If the moon is much, much smaller and much, much closer, then the craters are proportionally normal.
So if we follow his logic and shrink the universe, if the moon is that close, it's not a distant satellite, it is a literal neighbor.
A neighbor who might be sitting on their front porch watching us. Fort paints this incredibly cinematic picture of the 1860s, right during the U.S. Civil War era.
Down here on Earth, humans are just starting to form giant living symbols to communicate or celebrate.
He specifically mentions how thousands of people would gather in fields to arrange themselves into enormous representations, like the Liberty Bell, to be seen from above.
And Ford says, while we are doing that down here, astronomers were noticing that similar geometric shapes were appearing on the moon.
Specifically, these anomalies were centered in the lunar crater known as Linné. Astronomers during the 1860s were logging reports of observing a distinct geometric figure, a shape that was white-bordered and centered with black.
And this shape wasn't static. It was forming, dissolving, and forming again, almost like an iris opening and closing.
Fort's theory here is wildly imaginative, but it is logically consistent within his localized framework. He proposes that lunar inhabitants, a species he poetically calls the chiaroscurones, were actively signaling us.
The chiaroscurones, the artists of light and shadow. It is such an evocative name.
It really is. He envisions them standing on the terraced slopes of their lunar pyramids, dressed in stark black and white costumes, physically moving in unison to create these changing geometric patterns, much like the humans forming the Liberty Bell.
To these chiaroscurones, our Earth isn't a world of distinct people. It's a massive, changing, terrifying orb dominating their sky.
Fort beautifully describes how the Earth might look to them. When atmospheric mists and clouds cover our planet, to the moon it looks like a bland, silvery Buddha.
But when those mists clear and they look down and see the fiery red drip of our active volcanoes, Earth suddenly becomes an appalling, violent, carnivorous god.
I love that imagery so much. They're looking up at this terrifying, clutched fist of a planet, watching us wage the Civil War, seeing our volcanoes erupt, and they're essentially waving a white flag, trying to say hello.
And it's not just the moon that's trying to get our attention. Fort pulls data on anomalous flashes from Mars and Venus, too.
In December of 1900, there was a 70-minute fountain of light observed on the surface of Mars. Professor Pickering, a highly respected, noted astronomer of the time, logged it and called it absolutely inexplicable.
It wasn't a reflection, it was a sustained emission of light.
Then, a few years later, during the 1909 Mars opposition, when the planet was close, a series of distinct rhythmic flashes were seen in the clear sky over Epsom, England, seemingly originating from Mars.
And Fort asks the obvious, haunting question. Could this be a code? A cosmic serenade that we are entirely deaf to?
He notes that Orthodox astronomers instantly assume these flashes must be meteorological, lightning storms on Mars.
But Fort argues that if you look at the specific groupings and intervals of the flashes, it strongly suggests a signal-like intent, a rhythm.
It's a tragic story of miscommunication. An island of space or a neighboring planet is flashing a desperate greeting across the void, and our scientific establishment is logging it as a weird lightning storm.
We're getting serenaded by the cosmos, and we don't even know the tune. We just think it's static.
Fort even mentions Venus sending ships. In 1883, multiple witnesses reported a luminous vessel that seemed to sail out from the direction of Venus. It hovered incredibly close to Earth over Sussex, then moved to Liverpool, and was later sighted over Puerto Rico and Ohio.
It was described specifically as having a brilliant ray of light emanating from it, exactly like a modern airship with a searchlight sweeping the ground.
And let's not forget his brief mention of the rhinoceros of the skies, Mercury, which was occasionally observed with a wicked-looking horn of light sticking out of it.
Yeah.
If you believe Fort's data, We are completely surrounded by cosmic traffic.
But this brings up a massive logical hurdle. If the sky is genuinely this busy, if our neighbors are flashing rhythmic lights and dropping specific black stones on Chico and sailing ships with searchlights right over Liverpool, why isn't this common knowledge?
Why is it relegated to the fringe, to weird newspaper clippings?
This brings us to what Fort considers the true ultimate enemy of discovery. He calls it the doctrine of exclusionism.
Exclusionism, the unified, dogmatic, impenetrable wall of conventional science.
Exactly. Fort defines exclusionism as the unified approach of the scientific establishment that actively, sometimes violently, stifles speculation. It is a system designed to wall off all data pointing to external existences.
No, it's crucial to understand that Fort doesn't view exclusionism as a malicious, smoky room conspiracy of evil scientists trying to hide aliens.
Rather, it's an organic, psychological, and institutional blindness. When an organism, in this case, the global scientific establishment, commits to a specific model of reality, it must aggressively exclude anything that threatens that model in order to survive.
It's an immune response. So when a foreign object, like a space vessel or a piece of a sky island, explodes in the sky with such concussive force that it shakes the ground, the immune system of exclusionism kicks in to neutralize the threat.
Let's look at the Barisal guns in Bengal. For years, there were these unexplained, massive detonations in the clear sky.
Or the Fort Klamath explosion in Oregon in 1867. Witnesses heard an apocalyptic boom, and then actual ashes rained down from the sky, covering the ground.
But there was no active terrestrial volcano anywhere near Oregon at that time.
Or the 1921 earthquake in New Canton, Virginia, which violently shook the ground, but witnesses insisted it was accompanied by a massive visual explosion high in the sky.
Fort points out that seismologists and meteorologists function as the high priests and the gatekeepers of this exclusionism. Their assigned job is to protect the dogma of the isolated, moving Earth.
Whenever a space vessel or an extrageographic meteor explodes in the local sky, causing concussions on the ground, exclusionism demands that the anomaly be neutralized.
So it gets logged in the filing cabinet marked subterranean earthquake. The data is forced to fit the paradigm.
If strange, brilliant, clearly non-terrestrial lights appear in the sky, they can't be alien signals, so they are immediately reflexively logged as auroras.
And Ford points out how ridiculous that gets because they use that label even when the lights happen near the equator. He cites auroras reported in Venezuela or Cuba or India.
Since when do polar auroras happen in the Caribbean?
It doesn't matter to the exclusionist. The label protects the dogma. As long as it's called an aurora, the scientists don't have to worry about chiaroscurones waving at them.
So what does this all mean? If the scientific establishment is actively, aggressively relabeling alien signals as atmospheric lightning and sky explosions as subterranean earthquakes, why are they doing it?
Fort suggests it means they are, perhaps unconsciously, protecting us from a terrifying truth.
They are protecting the paradigm because the alternative is psychological anarchy. If you accept that these things are actually happening in the sky, you have to accept that the sky is not a vacuum.
You have to accept that the Earth is constantly interacting with a much larger physical and potentially very dangerous extrageography.
Which brings us to the truly wild, unsettling stuff falling from the sky. We talked about the black stones of Birmingham and Chico, but the sky's cargo is way weirder than just rocks.
Fort compiles reports of organic biological material. We have a mysterious glue-like substance falling in Sarthe, Belgium in 1901.
We have reports of thousands of exotic spiders and huge unknown ants falling onto the freezing snowy slopes of the Alps in 1922.
We have a literal documented shower of little frogs falling onto a farm in Connecticut in 1921. Now, conventional science says a tornado sucked up a pond.
But Fort has a different mechanical explanation.
This is where Fort applies a specific physical theory to the bizarre data. He rejects the tornado theory because a tornado would drop mud, debris, fish, and frogs all mixed together.
But these rains are highly specific. Only frogs or only spiders. So how are specific biological loads transferring from these hovering sky islands down to the Earth?
He posits a concept he calls difference of potential.
Okay, explain it to me like I'm 5. Because difference in potential sounds like standard electrical physics, but I know Ford is using it in a very non-standard way.
In standard physics, electrical potential difference, or voltage, is what causes current to flow between 2 points. Fort takes this concept and scales it up to planetary mechanics.
Think about how the Gulf Stream operates in the ocean. It moves massive volumes of water based on differences in water temperature and salinity.
Ford suggests there is an atmospheric electric difference of potential between the stationary Earth and the stationary hovering sky islands.
So he's saying a localized magnetic or electric storm opens up like a conduit between us and the floating island just above our atmosphere.
Exactly. It's an electric transfer system.
Yeah.
When the potential difference gets high enough, a localized vacuum or conduit opens up. It acts almost like a targeted cosmic transporter beam.
If a sky island has an overpopulation of frogs and a conduit opens up over Connecticut, the frogs are transferred down to equalize the potential.
It's an electric storm that represents a balancing of pressure between Earth and another world. And the terrifying part of Fort's theory is that this current works both ways,
Things fall down, yes, but things are also pulled up.
which leads to the absolute darkest, most chilling implication in the entire book, the concept of upward translations.
If a localized electric storm can selectively drop 1,000 frogs onto a farm in Connecticut, what happens when a massive continent-sized difference of potential opens up over a dense human civilization?
Fort uses this mechanic to ask some truly harrowing historical questions. He looks at history's vanishing acts. What happened to the Mayans? Entire civilizations, entire tribes and nations that seem to have simply disappeared from the archaeological record almost overnight.
What about the lost, undocumented eras of early Egypt?
Fort's imagery here is haunting. It's like something out of a cosmic horror novel. He describes the bones of the Mayans being picked clean by extrageographic space scavengers, their remains crystallized on some invisible sky pane above us.
He speculates about massive, catastrophic upward suctions sweeping an entire earlier iteration of Egypt away into the sky. He literally talks about floating avenues of frozen sphinxes and Egyptian mummies circulating in cosmic undulations trapped in the sky's Gulf Stream.
It's a grotesque but brilliant extension of his premise. It forces us to view the entire geosystem not as a collection of isolated, lonely rocks in a dead vacuum, but as a fluid, deeply interactive environment.
If sea monsters can fall from the sky into our oceans, and Fort suggests this is precisely why unknown leviathans suddenly appear in our seas, having been dropped from a water world above.
And terrestrial life can be sucked upward, then we are part of a massive, terrifying, open-source cosmic ecosystem.
So we have a stationary Earth, phantom cities hovering over glaciers, alien Morse code flashing from Mars, sky frogs raining on farms, and floating Egyptian mummies circulating in the stratosphere. It sounds like chaos.
But Fort isn't just throwing these out as random, disconnected, spooky stories. In the final chapters of Part 2, he ties all of this madness together into a grand unified theory, and this is where he takes dead aim at Charles Darwin.
Yes. Fort's ultimate overarching thesis in Part 2 is a direct philosophical challenge to Darwinian evolution. He argues that Darwinism is profoundly insufficient to explain the universe because it only looks backward.
It only looks at the past adapting to the present. It deals strictly with local, randomized adaptation. Fort proposes a much grander, inherently teleological concept. He calls it superembryonic development.
The idea of the incubating egg.
Exactly. Fort views the entire geosystem. The stationary Earth at the center, the hovering sky islands, the nearby planets like Mars and Venus, not as a random collection of matter, but as a single, enclosed, developing organism.
It is an incubating cosmic egg, with the Earth acting as the central, developing nucleus.
And in this theory, evolution isn't driven by random, pointless mutation. Instead, development is a predetermined passage along a strict schedule of phases, marching toward a final climax of unification.
Okay, but if that's true, if the sky is full of ships and lands and neighboring civilizations, and we are all part of one big organism, why is it kept completely secret from us? Why does the doctrine of exclusionism exist?
Why are we down here on Earth functionally blind to our neighbors?
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of embryology, Fort says it makes perfect logical sense. Think about how an embryo develops in the womb. The cells are walled off and isolated from one another until the scheduled time for their integration.
The heart cells don't integrate with the nervous system until the genetic blueprint explicitly calls for it.
Therefore, exclusionism, the grand delusion that we are isolated on a spinning globe by vast millions of miles of empty space, is not a mistake. It is a necessary, functional, protective shell.
It's keeping us safe. It's an incubator wall. We are literally like children being shielded from the terrifying, infinitely complex realities of the adult world until we are mature enough to handle them.
Precisely. Fort argues it would be a worldwide psychological and social disaster to spread the knowledge of these extrageographic neighbors too soon.
The peoples of Earth must organize, mature, and unify themselves internally before they are ready to conceive of, let alone establish, foreign relations with the Sky Islands. Exclusionism acts as the eggshell, keeping us safely ignorant while we gestate.
And Ford argues that if you try to break that shell before it's scheduled to break, you will inevitably fail. He brings up a fascinating historical analogy with Samuel Langley's flying machine.
Langley built a machine that was theoretically capable of flying, but it completely failed when he tried to launch it over the Potomac. Why? According to conventional history, engineering flaws.
But according to Ford, it failed because it was chronologically premature. The era, the embryonic phase of the Earth, simply wasn't ready for human flight to integrate into the system.
Fort calls Langley's attempt an aberration, a foreshadowing of a future phase. But it wasn't allowed to succeed because it wasn't on the cosmic schedule.
The Wright brothers succeeded just a few years later, not necessarily because their mechanical engineering was infinitely superior to Langley's, but because they synchronized with the underlying schedule of the Earth's development. The proper era had finally arrived. The organism was ready.
So, by extending that logic, true open contact with these floating lands, what Ford so beautifully calls the San Salvadors of the sky, cannot happen until our embryonic Earth reaches its next scheduled phase of development.
We literally cannot see them, we cannot reach them, and our scientists cannot accept the data until the cosmic clock strikes the exact right hour.
The shell has to break naturally. Fort notes that when the Carboniferous era was dominant on Earth, nothing discordant to that era was permitted to flourish. But phases pass.
The protective exclusions, the scientific dogmas of our current era, will eventually break down as the organism matures.
What a profound, exhausting journey. We have completely bypassed the safe, dry, boring math of Part 1, and we have thrown ourselves entirely into the absolute madness and bizarre brilliance of Part 2.
We've looked at the psychological filters that turn alien pilots into angels with belts and space armadas into phantom soldiers.
We've talked about the Chiaroscurolans waving at us from the Linnaeus crater while we fought the Civil War. We tried to make sense of frogs and black stones raining down from localized, stationary sky islands.
And we've envisioned the horrifying upward suction of the Mayan civilization into the cosmic Gulf Stream.
And we've tied all of that anomalous data together with the realization that our own ignorance, the rigid scientific exclusionism that dismisses alien signals as lightning and sky explosions as earthquakes, might actually just be the protective yoke of a massive, super embryonic cosmic egg.
It is a lot to process.
It is. I want to remind you, the listener, as we wrap this up, that the purpose of this deep dive isn't to convince you to throw away your globe and believe that the Earth is a stationary rock surrounded by floating Egyptian mummies.
I don't believe that, and I don't think you do either.
The purpose of reading Charles Fort is to break down the walls of how you perceive information. It is to show you how easily and reflexively conventional science dismisses the impossible, and to invite you to look at the anomalies, the weird outliers, the strange data points, and ask the dangerous question. What if the accepted model is wrong?
It is the ultimate exercise in extreme critical thinking. And to leave you with a final, lingering, beautifully bizarre image directly from the closing chapters of Fort's work.
Imagine the day that embryonic shell finally breaks, the day the era of our earthly isolation ends.
Imagine a massive triumphant procession marching up Broadway in New York City. It is led by a human explorer who has finally breached the atmospheric gap and returned from a newly discovered sky island.
And in that parade, he is leading by the nose an outrageous thing that should not be. A 10-foot-long, short-winged, web-footed monster.
A creature that, for centuries, humans on Earth had looked up at through the clouds, violently assimilated through their psychological filters, and mistakenly called an angel.
When you look up at the sky tonight, at the clouds, at the moon, and at the stars, ask yourself, what is actually looking back down?